Here we are at week 9 in our Introduction to Visual Art. We are continuing our conversation on two-dimensional art. Last week we spoke about painting, types of painting, methods of painting. The week before that we spoke about drawing, types of drawing and methods of drawing. But this week we're talking about something that you might not be quite so familiar with, and that's called printmaking. Printmaking is another form of two-dimensional art, and I find it to be very fascinating and a lot of fun, and hopefully you guys are interested in what I'm talking about. So what is printmaking? Printmaking is the activity of making pictures or designs by printing them from specially prepared plates or blocks. Printmaking is an excellent method of producing multiples or variations of a single image. The printmaking process begins with a design or image made in or on a surface by hitting or pressing with a tool. The image is then transferred to paper or a similar material. The transferred image is called a print. So, to reiterate, there are different methods of printmaking, but printmaking is important because because you can reproduce images. There are different ways of reproducing images, and that's what we're talking about today. So such as drawing, painting, and really all forms of art, there are many, many forms of printmaking. Some printmaking processes are very old. However, as technologies change, new methods are introduced. There are 4 major printmaking categories. And of course, these are what we're talking about today. We have relief printing, intaglio printing, lithography, and serigraphy. This is an image that shows sort of diagrams of different printmaking processes. It's not important that you understand this image right now, but I will be showing clips from this image. So here's the first clip of that. So this is demonstrating relief printing. In relief printing, the matrix is carved with knives and gouges. The matrix is perhaps wood, or it is perhaps linoleum, but it is a flat surface that you're carving into. That's what the matrix is. Areas that are not meant to be printed are cut below the surface of the matrix. Areas that are meant to be printed are left raised. So let's look at this image. We have the block. This is what I'm calling the matrix. In that first point that I made, areas that are not meant to be printed are cut below the surface. So say I'm going to lay paper on top of the block in order to make a print. Well, I say I want to make a print of several lines. I'm going to carve out a channel here, and carve out another channel, and carve out another one, and another one. And then what I'm going to get on the paper in the end is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 channels. So after your matrix is carved, you then apply ink to it. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines that are elevated above these channels, and those get ink on top of them. You lay the paper on top of that, and you pull the paper off, and what you have is a print of 5 lines, parallel lines in a row. So over here, referring to the second image, ink is applied to the raised surfaces. The third image, The matrix is pressed against a sheet of paper and the image is transferred. And then the transferred image is what we call a print. I've got a really great link here that we're going to go over, that we're going to watch, but first I want to show you a few prints. So this is an example of a relief print. What we see on the left is a flat piece of what's called linoleum. Linoleum is, I'm sure you've heard of it in terms of a linoleum floor. It's the same material, if not similar. And it's soft, and you can take little knives and little chisels and you can scrape out the areas. So this is the print that was made afterwards. There are a couple things I want to point out, that the print on the right is different than the block on the left. How is it different? Well, first of all, it's a reverse image. So it's like having a stamp on your hand. The stamp, if you were to hold the stamp, would have whatever, the date backwards or whatever's on the stamp. And then you put it on your hand, and then you have the forward image. So then another thing that's different is we're seeing color in this print. So what would have happened is that some of this area may have been painted, and then the black ink from this block was pressed onto it. So another print, woodcut. Woodcut is the oldest form of printmaking. Woodcuts are made by carving into the flat side of a board or a block of wood. So in this image, I showed you linoleum. Well, linoleum is a newer technology. What's very old is, of course, wood and flat boards. So this is a woodcut print where a flat board was carved into. That flat board would have been carved into several times in order to make this print, where the same board was used to print, say, this value or saturation of blue and the grays and the things like that. They'll print sort of the flat colors and then go in, carve on it more, print the next color, carve on it more, print the next color, and then you get several colors in the one print. This is another woodcut print. So this is a large print. It's about 2 feet by 2 feet. And when you work in such size, you can get pretty detailed. It can be difficult to get detailed when you are carving into the wood to get nice parallel lines. And this is another woodcut print. This one's a little smaller. This one is really detailed. It was done by a very skilled artist, obviously. So I want to go back to this video link. This will show us, this is a pretty cool link that'll show us relief printing.
I'm going to start this woodcut by using a piece of MDF, 26 by 36 inches, and then just taking some pictures for reference and using a graphite pencil to sketch the whole drawing. I will be using a ruler and some streams just to keep my lines straight in order to make the perspective right and to follow the original lines of the drawing that I'm trying to sketch. Later on, I move on into using Sharpies.
All right, so what he described is that he is drawing out the image on a big piece of wood. He called that wood MDF. MDF is sort of a nice composite. You can buy it at Home Depot. And he's going in and drawing it all again with a black permanent marker so that he can see his lines really well.
Making a whole drawing in black and white to your whole block really helps out to map how the potential final results is going to be. It really helps also to just create an idea of how you're going to be using your carving tool to continue the flow of your piece and enhance those parts, especially the textures and directions that you have, in order to create a background or foreground.
It's really wonderful watching him draw this.
Really explore the idea of dimension and depth. Printmaking is usually a two-dimensional practice or two-dimensional technique. However, it's a challenge that I learned from master printers.
So he's still just getting the image on there, and then soon he's going to carve into it.
This right here represents just breaking free from the big houses of how contains the wild spirit of this character.
Alright, so what he's doing now is he's adding a red dye to it. It makes him it easier for him to see what he's doing. So there he has with the he's got a chisel, and he's going in and he's removing areas that he does not want to print, leaving raised lines. Those raised lines are what will collect the ink. There he is rolling up some ink on what's called a brayer, and he's putting it on the board, getting it as even as he can.
Little Castaway, Lisa Master, ink in large blocks. After the whole piece is sold uniformly ink, you can run it through a press and pull your print.
So that's a beautiful print. What he didn't show you is the press, and there are other images, other videos I'll be showing you today that show a similar press. But what a press is a big sort of drum on a table, and you turn a crank and the table goes underneath the drum and it squeezes the paper against the board. And that's how it gets this like pressure in the ink. You remember that flying person in the drawing? It was on the left side when he was carving it. Now it's on the right side. Again, in a lot of methods of printmaking, in most methods, you're actually producing a reverse image, and then it comes out in a different way. So that is relief printing. Linoleum, woodcut. There's something called intaglio printing. Intaglio prints are created by metal plates which have been cut into or scratched. Reach deep into your pocket and pull out a dollar bill. And look at all the lines on the dollar bill. Look at all the lines in George's face, and you'll see that there are, if you look really closely, you'll see these, crisscrossing lines. That dollar bill was printed with the intaglio process. In the intaglio process, plates are covered with ink, which is forced into cuts and depressions. The surface is then carefully wiped. So you have a metal plate, and then you're going to scratch the plate, and you're going to put ink on top of it. It's going to fill in the troughs that you scratch. And then you're going to wipe the ink off the plate, leaving ink inside the grooves. The cut depressions retain the ink, whereas the flat surfaces are clean. Paper is laid atop the plate, and then paper and plate are passed through a printing press, forcing the paper into the incised lines to pick up the ink, thereby accepting the image. So, this process is different because it does not have ink sitting on the surface. The ink is in the groove. So it's not quite like a stamp. When your paper and the block and the metal run through the printing press, the paper gets forced into the grooves. It stretches and it gets pushed into the grooves, and that's where the print comes out. So, one of the types of intaglio is engraving. The earliest engravings printed on paper appeared in the 15th century. So, if you remember, I said as a side note during the painting lecture that the 15th century was the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a time where there was a lot of advancements in science and technology, and part of that was an advancement in being able to reproduce images. Do you remember the illuminated manuscripts where the monks would spend their entire lives painting and drawing the Bible? Well, once printing was invented, that sort of thing started becoming out of style, and that was in the Renaissance. So, in engraving, the artist creates clean cut lines on a plate of copper, zinc, or steel, forcing the sharpened point of a burin across the surface. A burin is just a fat needle with a really sharp point. Engravings are produced in presses under very high pressure, which forces the paper into the grooves. The press only reveals the print, but the printed lines are actually raised from the process. All right, so there's nothing special going on here other than you're taking a tool and you're scratching a softer metal with that tool. Zinc or copper, usually. Steel, sometimes. Let's check out this link.
I'm Emily Peters, Associate Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the RISD Museum. And I'm here with Andrew Raftery, who is a professor of printmaking at the Rhode Island School of Design. And
so I'm getting ready to trace the copy drawing. And I want it to be, I'm going to trace it, and then I'm going to flip the tracing over so I can reverse it.
So in this video, this man is reproducing this drawing by Francesco Primatticchio.
It's the kind of drawing that would have been used by an engraver.
He's simply just transferring it onto the metal.
After this drawing, and in doing so, he worked out some of the iconographic elements and the.
And then I'm ready to remove the tracing from the drawing. So I'm going to use the tracing and then trace through the tracing paper with the stylus. And that's going to leave the drawing on the plate just lightly touched onto the wax.
All right, so he's just transferring it with tracing paper.
I'm using this steel tool.
And then that's the burin in his hand. And he is
the lines I made with the wax.
Following the lines.
And I'm scratching them in the plate with the tool. And I'm going to place the plate onto this sand-filled pad. And that allows me to have a kind of pivoting action when I work the plate, because one of the principles of engraving, especially for curves, is that the plate is inserted in this handle. And as I'm pushing the plate, a curl of copper is emerging.
You see?
And that curl of copper is called the burr. Have been laid in, I started to develop art.
All right, so after his drawing is really carved into the metal,
This is a dauber.
he takes ink and he spreads it onto the plate.
Now I'm just going to
Of an engraving.
And then he's going to wipe the ink off the plate.
So the force of the printing press will pull the ink from inside those incised lines.
So I've done as much as I can do with the rags, and I'm ready for the next stage, which is called hand wiping. So I use a little bit of
There he is,
paper's been sitting
cleaning it. All right, so here he has paper that he's soaking in water.
of the gelatin and the fibers of the
It softens up the paper
and now I'm just
so
going
that
to
when it goes through the
bring it
printing
up to the
press,
cutting area.
it can really push and stretch a little bit more. He's going to
Click on it.
dry off the paper a little bit.
Honors.
A hermaphrodite that no other engraver has attempted. Engravers of that period.
And so he has the plate with the ink on it, and there's the paper
Pull back the
going
plate.
through the press. Now watch him pull the paper back.
To remove the impression from the plate. You can see that the print is in reverse of the engraved image.
And that is the etching process. What's interesting here is you see a color or a value in that circle. The reason why is that ink that he worked so hard to clean off didn't truly come off. So it often leaves a bit of a shadow. Uh-oh. Okay. Dry point is very similar to that video we just saw, very similar to etching. One of the big differences is that when you're etching, you're really cutting the copper plate and the pieces come off. But in dry point, you're more like scratching it and you're moving the copper plate around a little bit, leaving this sort of ghostly edge. The needle dragged across the surface of a metal plate, leaving a burred edge. So that burred edge, imagine running your finger along it. It'll be sharp, perhaps. It'll be rough. You'll be able to feel it on your fingertips. Well, that burred edge retains ink, creating a softened rather than crisp line when printed. The big difference between the two is one is very precise, very clean, and the other one has this sort of rough edge that leaves sort of a soft print. So there's something called etching as opposed to engraving, which I might have mixed up the two a few times, but engraving, this is still engraving, but dry point. Etching. In etching, a metal plate is covered with a liquid acid-resistant ground made of wax. When the ground is hardened, the image is drawn upon it with a fine needle. When the drawing is complete, the metal plate is put in an acid bath which eats away or etches the exposed areas of the plate, the scratches. The longer the plate remains in the acid bath, the deeper the etching gets. Deeper crevices hold more ink and produce darker lines. This is an etching. What's nice about etching is that you're using acid to eat at the plate, meaning you're not using your wrists or your arms to really carve into metal. It's a lot easier and perhaps easier to really sort of spend time on. This is a photo etching, and that is a process of using photography, but you're also you're transferring a photographic image onto a plate, but you're also using that resist. We're not going to get into it so much, but I do want you to know that photo etching is a thing. All right, let's check out this video.
Are also used for etching. Etching involves several steps. The first step is to prepare the plate, which involves polishing and cleaning so that there are no marks or scratches on the surface that could interfere with the artist's drawing. The second step would be applying a ground to the plate. Hard ground is typically made from asphaltum, wax, and rosin. It acts as an acid resist, protecting the white or non-image areas of the etching plate.
What he just described is this wax type thing that he's now going to coat onto this copper plate, and this copper plate is ultimately going to be dipped into a bath of acid. And this wax resists the acid.
And preparing that ground so that it is dark enough to see the copper showing through wherever the ground has been scratched away. To smoke the plate is held upside down so that the ground can be heated and absorb the soot. Once a plate has been prepared with a ground, the surface is a jet black. Drawing a plate involves scratching away the ground so that copper is revealed. This is different than dry point. Dry point's scratching of the plate is to create a burr or to move metal. In this case, we're actually only barely scratching the surface just to remove the ground. Wherever copper is showing through that black ground, it will be etched or eaten away to create a trough for ink to sit in.
I like to equate this process more with drawing. So drawing with a pencil. You're not pressing hard. It's pretty easy to do, as you can tell.
So the copper lines become the image that will be printed onto paper. The third step in etching is etching the plate. This is a process of eating away all of the bare copper areas showing on the plate deep into recesses that will hold ink. The plate is etched for 15 minutes, then it is pulled out and rinsed and replaced back in the bath for an additional 15 minutes to create a fine, even black line. Once the plate has been etched, the ground has been removed, and the plate has been cleaned, it is now prepared for printing. All intaglio processes are printed in the same format. Printing involves wiping the plate with ink to force ink into the recesses of the plate, utilizing tarlatan.
This is similar to any other process from now on. The acid is what really sets this apart.
The edges so that all of the white areas of the paper is laid on top.
There he is with the printing press again.
Artists like intaglio processes because it's a very
And there's the
sculptural way
print.
of working. And that sculptural process of manipulating a metal surface is evident in the final print with raised ink and embossed edges.
So, etching. You're still creating grooves that fill with ink. And then you're still pressing paper into those grooves. But it's using acid, which I think makes it interesting. All right, so to recap, the difference between intaglio with etching, engraving, or dry point is that the ink goes into a groove and the paper gets pressed into that groove. And that's different than a woodcut or a relief print in which the ink sits on top of the board like a stamp. All right, let's shift our thinking a little bit, and we're going to talk about lithography. Lithography is a surface printing process. In this, the artist draws an image with a greasy crayon directly onto a flat stone slab and is fixed with nitric acid. The entire surface is dampened with water. The entire stone surface is dampened with water, but the greasy crayon repels it. A roller covers the stone with an oily ink that adheres to the crayon, but it is repelled by the water. When a paper is pressed against the stone surface, the ink on the crayon is transferred to the paper, revealing the image. I know that sounds complicated because it is complicated, but I think I can describe it to you. This is an actual stone. You can draw on here with what's called a grease crayon or with any greasy substance. And then you can cover this grease with water. That water is repelled by the grease, therefore it sits in between these grooves. Then you roll the ink on there, and that ink sticks to the grease, and the ink is also repelled by water. And then at the very last step, you press the paper onto the stone, and you selectively get this ink in these three grooves or lines that are transferred to the paper. Another way to think about this is a story that I don't know is true. But this story is about the origins of lithography. Where back in the day, I want to say like the 1700s, there was this very busy man. We'll call him the man of the house. Had this honeydew list where his wife gave him a list of things to do for the day. And that list was written with a crayon. He left that list on his countertop, and the sun came in from the window and it melted that crayon onto the countertop. He picked up the list, he went on with his day, but then the man of the house lost the list. He couldn't find it. But he knew that it was written on his countertop, that it had transferred to the countertop. So then he decided to develop a way of getting that list off the countertop. And that's what he developed. Was, okay, well maybe I can rub water or sponge this with water, then take some ink and roll it on top of the ink, lay some paper on there, pull it off, voila. That's how he got his list back. I don't know if it's a true story, but when I think about that, it helps me to understand the lithography process. These are some lithographs. So this lithograph was drawn by probably using a grease crayon directly onto a slab of stone. This similarly, I don't know how similar this is. This is also a lithograph. And the way this would have been made is by using using straight lines and maybe a paintbrush to draw with or paint with a different type of grease, you know. So this was put on there by a different method. There are different methods of, once you get into lithography, you'll discover, oh, there are all these ways of producing an image. And some of those ways aren't necessarily clear to the viewer, but that's because there's so many ways to do it. All right, let's watch this video on lithography.
This introduction to lithography will show the artist's drawing process, materials that are used on drawing a lithographic stone.
So these are all methods. Did you see that? Hopefully you remember this guy. He's our friend from the what was it? Acid etching. All right, so there we have grease crayons or grease pencils, and then there's a solution of grease that he was painting with. This is your actual slab of stone. Imagine a gravestone, you know. It's a big, chunky piece of stone.
Of printing and the details and subtlety that can be achieved in the printing process, as well as a close-up look at prints themselves. Lithography, or stone printing, is an intricate printmaking process that revolves around grease and water resisting one another. An artist will draw the greasy material on a lithographic stone. Once we've established a drawing or grease on the stone, we chemically treat the stone with materials like gum arabic to establish the areas where water goes, rosin and talc to help us
All right, so
basically to establish the drawing down inside the stone.
The process is complicated. It's more complicated than you need to know. But there are a lot of different... This process has been perfected over time. And so he's using different solvents, and he's using something called gum arabic and stuff like that in order to produce sort of an excellent image. I mean, this has been perfected ongoing for the past 300 years.
Once the grease is pulled into the stone, we can replace the drawing material with any colored greasy ink that we would like.
So
the materials that we use from a historic standpoint are things like litho pencils, and it's pencil when it's in this sort of format. So the lower the number, because the greasier and waxier that material is. So if you want a fine, hard, they come in varying sizes and hardnesses as well. The surface of to put drawing material down and then remove the drawing material and apply printing ink to it, which is what's called proving the stone. So now the drawing material has a small amount of talc and rosin attached to it, and it's ready to be etched. So we first apply the gum arabic to the stone, and once the stone has begun to receive the gum into it, we can apply the acidified gum arabic, in this case, which is tape. That acidification with tannic acid helps the acid on the surface of the stone, so that when we buff in the gum arabic into a very thin and even sheet, we don't run the risk of having too much very ink-receptive base for the ink on the roller to replace it with. At this point, your drawing will disappear. It's not actually gone, and what you can see is a residue, or a ghost image as we call it, there on the surface of the stone. That is where the stone has been converted to soap or oleomanganate of lime. And etched properly, you'll be able to see a fairly clear ghost image on the surface of the stone. What will be happening next is that we are going to wet the surface of the stone. I will go over it with a wet towel and a dry towel. Kate will sponge that surface, and I will apply ink immediately to the stone.
all right, let's do that.
Cover it with a wet towel and a dry towel. Kate will sponge that surface.
So she's adding water, and he's going to add the ink.
Bring up our image. In the beginning, we're not actually into the stone. See, only a very small amount of ink has actually been transferred because we're starting to push ink into the stone first. It's an average of 4 to 6 newsprints. So when printing on a dampened sheet of paper, we can achieve a different tonal range based on the softness of that paper. What we want to do is match that movement and flow of the hand. So what I'm looking for with the drawing material. And if it has, and if it maintains that character, then we consider that a good impression.
So, like
Come up to a full ink.
this video has a lot of information, has more information than you need to know. But just
So when printing on a dampened sheet of paper, we can
see
achieve
that
a different.
there is a process of adding water and ink, then putting the paper down, running through the press again and again and again. Lithography is actually a lot of fun, and when I was in college, I did a lot of lithography. But another thing that I did in college was screen printing. This is what this is a sort of class of printmaking called serigraphy. But the most common, and the thing that I'm really familiar with, is screen printing. Screen printing is fun. You can do it at home. When I was a punk in my younger days, I was, putting together shows and like music shows and things like that. And I was screen printing posters to get them out into the world. And screen printing is a lot of fun. A lot of stuff around you is screen printed. Your t-shirt, if it has a logo on it, that's been screen printed. To some capacity, even your can of Coca-Cola, that was screen printed as well. Screen printing is the newest of all these processes, but it's very cool. And if you have an opportunity to learn how to screen print, I think you should. So screen printing is different than the others. In fact, it doesn't even produce a reverse image. All the others, you're laying the paper on top of the, say, the matrix, or like the wood or the stone or the metal, and you're running through the press, and you're getting a reverse image. This is different. You can think of screen printing more as a stencil, and we'll get into that here. So screen printing is a process that begins with a screen constructed of a piece of silk stretched over a frame. A stencil with a cutout design is affixed to the screen and a paper is placed beneath it. The artist forces ink through the open areas of the stencil with a flat squeegee with a rubber blade. Now, the stencil can be made out of different things. It can be made out of paper. What's really very common is the use of emulsion. Emulsion is a photosensitive sort of liquid that is spread onto the screen, and we will talk about that soon. So this flat piece at the bottom, you can consider that a screen. So a lightly woven silk mesh. And then there is something called a mask put on here. A mask sort of holds that mesh and it dries on it, and it blocks any ink from going through it. So you can spread ink on top of the porous screen and on top of the mask, and then you put all of this on top of a piece of paper, and you use a squeegee. Imagine, what you use for cleaning your windows at the gas station. Use a squeegee, and you really scrape across the top, and it presses the ink through the mesh, and that results in an image on the paper below it. So other screen printing processes include painting a varnish or melting wax into the mesh of the screen to block ink from passing through. So your mask can be a crayon, like a Crayola crayon that you draw on the screen, and it's going to fill those pores in the screen and prevent ink from going through it. The mask can be made of a light-sensitive gel called emulsion that allows for photographic images to be printed. And then punk or DIY posters may be screen printed. Also, t-shirts are commonly screen printed. So let's look at some screen prints. This is a print by Andy Warhol. One of the things that he really did very well when he was alive was screen printing. And so here we're looking at Marilyn Monroe. You can also get flat colors in the screen printing. All right, let's look at some videos. I think this is an interesting video. It shows, let's see, we have a frame. This frame is made out of aluminum, and then this fabric is silk, a lightly woven silk. He lays it on top of the frame, and he glues it down on one side. And he's going to use this little contraption to stretch the silk. All right. So after this is made, I guess he's going to clean it up. And then he's going to add emulsion to it. Oh, okay. He's going to make what's called a negative. So in Photoshop on his computer, he printed out an image of that cute little puppy. And now he's making emulsion. This is the light sensitive stuff. So when it's exposed to ultraviolet light, this liquid hardens. All right, so he is coating his screen with that emulsion. Drying it. Now he's putting the transparency on the screen. And he's going to take it outside. expose it to the sun for 5 minutes. Do you see that this has turned black? Sometimes different emulsions, they change color as an indicator that they are that they've hardened. So the sunlight hardens the area that it's been exposed to. So that's the screen, and what he's doing is he's washing out the area to make this sort of ghost image. But what that is a place, all those lines, they're places where the emulsion isn't, creating, like I said, essentially a stencil. Now he's going to print the t-shirt. He's going to put ink on there and spread it on. So that ink traveled through the screen in selective areas. It's also possible to print more than one color. Do you remember back when we spoke about, what did we speak about? Subtractive color, where one color, like with your television screen, where one color mixed with another color makes you see another color. So when you're doing full color printing, you're printing four colors. One is called cyan. Cyan is a bluish color. Magenta, which is a reddish, pinkish color. Yellow, and black. That's what is used on your television. That's also what's used in newspapers. You can use, lithography, for example, to do full color printing, but it's also very common in screen printing. And the way you do it is you take your image and you separate it into different, what's called channels. So you've got cyan, magenta, yellow, black, different transparencies, different channels, and then you're going to convert each of these images into dots. Some of these dots are closer together, some are farther away. And that's how the image sort of mixes visually. Alright, so there he printed yellow and red, or magenta. So yellow, magenta, cyan. The image is looking pretty good. Now he just has to add black to it. It's a pretty beautiful image. So, screen printing. Uh-oh. Screen printing is one of several processes. I think it's really fun, but so is lithography and etching. They're all fun in their own ways. And I encourage everybody to take a class, take an art class, take a printing class, and study some of these. That's it for the week 9 lecture. Now please watch the Art of the Day lecture, and your quiz will be on printmaking and the Art of the Day presentations.